Welcome to our second day of the Ann Lister Research Summit. Thank you to everyone for showing up at a bit of an odd time for many of you. We appreciate you coming and having listened to our session. And we're hoping you're enjoying all of the sessions so far. It was certainly a very fun first day. And we're excited to kick off the second. So for any of you who were here last year, you might recognize Dannielle and I from a session last year, and we're very excited to be back again. Just some general housekeeping before we start. We're just going to do our presentation, and if you have any questions as we go, just pop them in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. But basically just a quick introduction of us. My name is Jenna. I found out about Ann through Gentleman Jack, obviously got fascinated as we all did, and got involved with the code breaking project for about a year, and got linked in with the Pact with Potential team and help out when I have time outside of my nursing school. And luckily got linked in with Dannielle, who is also in Australia, and we've had the lovely luxury of being able to build a sort of friendship through Ann, which I think is something that we can all relate to, the nice community that has built up around Ann. So Dannielle, do you want to give a quick introduction of yourself?
Yep. Thanks, Jenna. Yes, we've become Ann friends. I did I did my honours thesis on Ann, and I also did my PhD on Ann more years ago now than I can remember. And so this is nice. I kind of revisit Ann now after a long time away from Ann. So it's lovely to come and talk Ann to a lot of Ann fans. And I looked specifically at the period for my doctoral thesis. I specifically looked at the period that Ann was in Paris, where in 1824 to 1825, and with the relationship that she had with Mrs. Barlow. And for that, I looked at the archives, which was fascinating to me because prior to that, I'd only looked at, in my honours work on Ann, I'd only been able to look at the edited versions of her diaries. So what a treat. Anyway, I'll now try and share our presentation.
Yeah.
Pray this works.
Yeah. So basically what we're going to be talking about today is maybe trying to introduce kind of a new side of Ann Lister that maybe doesn't always come across in some of the published work about Ann, and that is the very kind of methodical writer that Ann was. And so we're going to be focusing on looking at how Ann wrote, how she structured the things that she wrote, some of the techniques that she used to actually make what she was writing useful for her and usable and an accurate kind of account of her life. And since it's the area that Dannielle obviously knows heaps about, we have chosen a date from her Paris, time in Paris in 1825. We won't be talking loads about the actual context of the entry on this day, but we'll drop the links to the transcripts of this day's entry and the letter that she writes that day in the chat. And I definitely highly recommend having a read of them. It's a really juicy entry. It's a really, really interesting entry, lots of details, some fun bits with Maria. So definitely have
explicit content warning.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a really interesting one. Yeah, so the day that we've chosen is Sunday, the 30th of January, 1825. And we picked this day. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Jenna. Yeah, and yeah, we did pick this day. We're going to look at it in the order that she wrote the day. Yeah. Sorry, Jenna, what were you going to say?
We chose this day because it is a good day for kind of highlighting her technique. It's a very writing intensive day. She uses a lot of the strategies that she uses to kind of structure the way that she wrote. and it's a good way of kind of illustrating a lot of the structural aspects of Anne's journal writing.
Yeah, and this is what it looks like. So as you can see, it's actually a really heavily crypted day. And it's just, yeah, it does go over the page a little, but it's quite an interesting day. She's just moved into Quai Voltaire with Mrs. Barlow about 2 weeks before, but it was a day that just demonstrated so many of her techniques that it was a really good way to kind of actually take this deep dive into all her writing.
Yeah, so you can kind of see like how she lays out an entry. And the little part that we had boxed out is kind of the first time that she mentions sitting down and writing. And she sits down and writes that after breakfast, she sits down and she writes from Memoranda, which is an interesting technique that Anne uses kind of throughout her life, and we'll dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah. But it's a really interesting day because she just wrote and wrote and wrote all day. And a lot of it was using these memoranda. So it was really interesting in that respect, because it's quite a highly accurate day because it's come through twice in a way. You can see here she wrote memoranda of today and yesterday, and then she wrote up memoranda for days before that as well. But the interesting thing is we have the journals, but we don't necessarily have the memoranda anymore. And we know that she did actually keep a record. And she talks in previous years, earlier in 1822, of having a little pocket casebook of Eliza's. So probably something quite small that does fit into a pocket. And she talks about rubbing out the writing in that, making notes in it, and making memoranda, as she says there, on that September date. She talks about making memoranda made at the moment. And she even, it's kind of really floral writing even, how she quotes herself writing memoranda of Monsieur le Capitaine, who's unceremoniously styled an impudent fellow.
Yeah. No, the thing that I like about the memoranda with those in particular, I have a very distinct mental image of Anne in a room full of other people and then just with a little notebook scribbling away. But I also think that what's interesting about the memoranda is it's kind of a lifelong practice. This is something that she did consistently with her writing, but it's also a very flexible practice. There's in January, she sits down at the end of the day and writes memoranda, compared to the one in September where she's doing it in the moment. She uses different things, and where, in 1840, she refers to using a rough book. In 1822, she refers to using the pocketbook from Eliza. It was a very flexible practice, and it adapted to kind of the situation, but it was something that she used throughout her life to kind of let her have this very accurate record of what was happening. Yeah.
In this particular time, you're right, Jenna, too, in this particular time in Paris, I think really it was really evident that she was really doing the memoranda when she was just so busy that she didn't have time. So there's fluctuations through the journal writing in Paris where she's going straight from the activities of the day, so the experience, and then she's going to the journal entry directly. Or the journal writing, I should say, directly. Whereas other times like this, where she has just had this intense activity of leaving Madame de Bouffier's place, and she's moving in with Mrs. Barlow, and they've got visitors and they're unpacking and they're re-establishing their house, and she's just so busy. So there you see she's going from experience to memoranda do the journal entry.
Yeah.
So then we get, all the writing that she did that day. Was it this time, Jenna? I've forgotten which of these writing sessions exactly, but she actually marks that accordingly interrupted one of these writing sessions where she was actually documenting how she was having sex with Mrs. Barlow, and accordingly comes in. So that stopped the sex.
Yeah, the day basically played out where they woke up and had some nice time in bed before getting up, but accordingly interrupts, as she did frequently throughout their relationship. It's quite hilarious how many times accordingly obliviously came in while they were busy, but then immediately after just starts writing and basically only takes breaks the entire day to have meals.
Yeah.
So she's basically writing writing literally almost the entire day. So this is the now the third session. So that, she's had dinner, they've had tea, she had a quick chat with Maria, and now she's back to writing again.
Yeah.
My hand hurts just like thinking about trying to write that much.
And it really just shows her dedication, doesn't it? Like, she won't just leave a day and leave it missing. She's got the memoranda, so she just absolutely dedicates herself to her writing the whole day, and catching herself up for what is about 6 or 7 days of, of kind of would have been empty pages in the journal, but, full of the memoranda booklet, which we don't have in the records. That might have been full. We don't know how big that was.
Yeah.
So some of the things then with this really intensive day were practices that were really distinctive to Anne's writing that we thought we could have a look at, because they are, they're common for the Paris period, but they change and grow and drop away as she develops her writing over all the decades. And this first one that we're looking at is her, and Jenna's boxed it out there really beautifully in the entry, is striking outs, which are possibly done as she's writing, I think, because if you look at the way the writing flows, the handwriting flows, it looks like it's immediate and part of the writing process.
And I think it's interesting that just looking at kind of when and where they happen, and what she's talking about, and if they there aren't many examples in this entry, but 2 of the 3 of them happen in the cryptid sections where it's very kind of high emotional intensity, and just kind of, it's interesting to think about like when these happen, why they might happen, if there's particular reasons they might happen. Obviously it's kind of speculation, but it's we can look at kind of if there's relationships in when they occur.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's really that intensity of the emotional conversations and the interactions she's recounting. It's really revealing that it happens in these, particularly in the cryptid sections, but also that recounting in the plain hand section where she's actually talking about how the day played out with her writing as well. So there's a real need for reportage and accuracy here.
So another kind of almost editing style that she has is she will put in insertions, like a little caret to add something in. And these ones, at least to me, it seems a little bit harder to tell kind of when exactly she goes in and puts these in, if, you know, she's continued the sentence and kind of right away like, oh, I forgot, and adds it in, or if it's kind of a later when she's, you know, reading back over it and then she remembers something and adds it in. You know, it's a bit harder to tell when maybe she's adding those. But this entry has I don't know if there's really any meaning to it. It's just kind of a quirky one, where she does this insertion in the middle of a cryptid sentence, and instead of putting the insertion where you would think it would be at, you know, at a word break, she just puts it right in the middle of a word. So like if you look at the bolded part of the transcription, that's the insertion. But if you read it without the insertion from the cryptand, it just reads, to me, you have been writing all the day and Jane's being here interrupted me. Because in Anne's cryptand, the 4 can be translated as either an I or a J. So when she then goes back to do the insertion, she inserts it after the what had been a JA for Jane. But when she makes the insertion, it actually changes the meaning of that 4 to make it I am accustomed. So she like actually changes the meaning of one of the letters in her cryptand. And it just seems like such an odd way to do an insertion instead of just doing it at a, you know, at the end of a word. But I feel like it shows just how, you know, comfortable she was with her cryptand, and just ran really smoothly that it, you know, it was just like, oh, well, that's already there. So.
And it shows comfort, but also like how dexterous a facility she had with the crypt, that she could just, you know, quickly read and insert, you know, in such an appropriate spot, really, that she didn't have to kind of cast around. She just, oh, that works, you know, I'll insert it. I think this one, it looks to me, but like I totally agree with you, Jenna. It's hard to say. I feel like the insertions are possibly more of an editing process than a writing process. This one, the you know, the ink pen is fainter, and the line above and below are darker. So it does suggest that it came back, you know, at a different time. She read over it and she came back and then wrote it in. And sometimes there is very, very slight smudging, which suggests that it's done more at the moment. But it's hard to say. But I think the takeaway is that she's the insertions are, again, this absolute need to be reporting accurately on her emotions, on the sequencing of events, on what was said, who said it, on this ability for the journal to capture all her memories and actions and everything so accurately. So, but it's lovely because I hadn't picked that up at all with the crypt. Jenna was the one who noticed that. It was like, wow, that's my heading. But of course, something else that I looked at a lot in my work, which fascinates me so much, is her symbols. So we thought we'd take you through some, not all, because there is a venereal mark in this journal entry as well, but we're looking mainly at the writing practices. So some of her symbology is what we thought we'd focus on here, and we're looking at her section marking. So here are 2 examples from the day of her double section marking in the journal entry margin, journal margins, and then the single section marking, and with a bit of the text beside to show you what it looks like. That stuff then went into, oh, have I missed a slide? No, I haven't, sorry. There is some indication that the section marks in the journal entry actually just relate to instancing. So one section mark meant one instance of something she wanted to record, and 2 meant 2 things that she wanted to record. And then they got transferred into the index here. But this stays a little bit complicated, actually, and blurs the boundaries nicely. So we will take you through it. But that's the index page there.
And these would be like at the end of the volumes. So like if you were holding Anne's journal, she would be writing in the entry, and then she would flip it over so it was upside down, and then fill in the index from the back. So then eventually the entries would run into the index, and that was when she would run out of space in her journal.
Actually, I know, I was just looking over something this morning, and she did that in one of the 1820s volumes, not this one, but she did actually meet herself in one of the 1820s volumes. So this is how it goes. And Jenna did all this wonderful work. This is just beautiful how this all moves into the index. So it's a couple of slides here to show you how it works. Do you want to start us off, Jenna?
Sure. So we wanted to just kind of illustrate the process of building her index. So we'll kind of take you through each of the parts that she marked in the journal entry with the section marks that were a signal that, okay, something is going into the index. So this slide, this is the first little section that she places a double section mark. And so then you can look at the transcription, and the parts that we have kind of in the boxes and then bolded in the transcription. You can then look down to at the bottom where we have the screenshot of the actual index entry. And then you can see the bolded part where it's a direct transcription from the entry of what she wanted to carry into the index. So it's interesting to think about, you know, she goes through, and I'm assuming she would be putting in the section marks kind of as she's writing, but then can go back and like, okay, and then she fills in her index, and she's kind of going back and forth and like transcribes verbatim this thing that was important to her from that entry.
And that's where I always thought was possibly where you get the insertions and those editings. But it's a lovely sequence here because, as you can see, she actually, for this particular day, she had 6 double section marks and she had 1 single section mark. So here we have the 2 lines that relate to the first double section mark. So yeah, and this is where the explicit content warning comes in. So they are having a discussion about their sexual practices and likes and dislikes, and very intimate discussion. And you can see here that Anne's lifted, marked the double section mark for the pleasure was when she came down to me and how Mrs. Barlow had felt. And then you can see that then taken straight into the index.
Yeah, and this is kind of an example of when it's 2 distinct things. It's a double section mark and it's 2 distinct things that she brings in this example.
Yeah. And then this one is a double section mark where they're talking about what Anne's practice, or Anne's talking about what she does. And this one is, you couldn't really say this is 2 different topics. So this one is where it is a nice blurring between how the section mark works, because this one really is about actually something very important sexually. So perhaps here the double section mark actually indicates that sort of gradation of intensity or emotional reportage. And then there's this one.
Yeah, so this one's kind of going back to it's the same sort of subject, but there's two kind of two little snippets that are separated that she carries into the index. And in this this part that she marked, it's a very important part. And it's when Maria Barlow and Anne are talking about Mariana and Anne's relationship with Mariana. And Mrs. Barlow expresses that she would be very upset if Mariana ever found out about her relationship with Anne, and says that she thinks it would kill her if Mariana found out. And this makes a very big impact on Anne, and it's a very important conversation that they're having. But another interesting kind of thing about this specific transition from the entry to the index is the other ones have all been kind of direct transcriptions, and it is the direct words, but she switches the order around in this case, which is interesting. So, the part that she is boxed first actually comes second in the index, which is, don't know why she does that, but she just switched those two around for some reason.
Whereas this one, she goes back to, again, two topics, and in the sequence that she's section marked it. So here she's going and talking to Mrs. Barlow about her circumstances. So we know, of course, her circumstances were that she was going to inherit Shibden one day, but she couldn't promise a life of security yet to Mrs. Barlow because she didn't really know. Her circumstances were still dependent. But that's nothing that she needs to blame herself for. That's just the way things are in her situation and her life. But there's an interesting, and then here, of course, we can see that she's got, in this particular section of coding, she's got both an insertion and a strike through in the wider line. So it's kind of indicating, it's very important and emotionally intense, difficult, and yet very honest conversation that she's having with Mrs. Barlow.
Yeah. And then, so this
you get the juicy one.
This is the final double section mark of the entry. And it marks some of the kind of sexual talk that Anne was engaging in with Mrs. Barlow. And she marks some of the things that she says to Mrs. Barlow. And again, it's the same sort of thing where she carries it over as basically a direct transcription. She doesn't carry over Maria's reaction to what she's saying, which I find very funny because she just laughs and calls her a pig. And it gives me a really nice picture of their relationship where they're, just very comfortable with each other and just laughing and just, having fun with each other. But I think it's interesting just seeing what things Anne pulls out as being important and kind of important milestones in their relationship.
Yeah. Sorry, I was laughing and moved on a slide. I like that just shows, they've got this kind of rapport with each other that's really lovely, you pig.
Yeah.
And then this is the last section mark in that particular journal entry for the 30th of January, and this one's a single section mark. And this one is interesting too, even though it's one thought in the index, it's just summarised why Mrs. Barlow felt low today. But when you track this back to the journal entry, it's actually quite an extended comment from Mrs. Barlow of why she's actually upset with Anne, because Anne has been writing all day and neglected Mrs. Barlow a bit, and so Mrs. Barlow hasn't been able to do anything, and yeah, I interpret it as feeling a bit neglected.
Yeah. I mean, fair. Anne has definitely been she's been writing from about when they woke up until like 5 a.m. So
but that's how you move from then the journal entry to the index. But then, as you would have all noticed as we actually showed that transition, there's a different indexing, section marking, going on in the index again, and it doesn't match the way she section marked her journal entry. And when you have a look at that, you can see that the comments in the index that are section marked are only 2 comments, being one about Mariana knowing about the relationship with Mrs. Barlow, and Mrs. Barlow saying if she did, she thinks it would kill her. And that one's triple section marked. And then the sexual talk about Anne and how she gets pleasure from smelling and tasting her is single section marked. And one of the things that I was looking at with my work was that this, to me, presents this section marking that she does in the index actually presents as another layer of storytelling of Anne's writing about herself and constructing a story of this relationship in Paris. And there were only 12 triple section marks in Paris, and this is about midway. And Jenna has pulled out all of the triple section marks here, and you can see the 30th of January there. And then this is maybe, this was what I thought was Anne's story that she was actually telling about her relationship with Mrs. Barlow in Paris.
Yeah, it feels kind of like a summary. Like if she were to go through and say, okay, this is what my experience with Maria Barlow was. You know, these would be the points that she would hit. And it's I like this entry specifically, the 30th of January, because it, like you say, it's kind of towards the middle-ish of when they're really, you know, in a relationship kind of situation. And they're kind of at like the sweet spot, you know, they've just moved in together. They're kind of figuring out how serious it's going to be. They're really comfortable with each other, you know, like they're having really frank, open discussions about their intimacy and what they want and what they like. You know, they're not easy conversations to have. And the fact that they were just so completely open about that with each other was surprising to me. And it was really nice to read, you know, seeing this relationship where they were so open with each other. And they seemed to, you know, they were happy and they were laughing, and it was all really nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is kind of like right at that stage where, but it's getting to the point where it's like, okay, we need to start deciding, you know, future planning. Like, what is this actually going to be? And that's kind of when some of the tensions start coming back in.
Yeah. And then it's just going back to the writing practices, it's just a really nice story too to look at, because you can see here how she's made a mistake, and in a period of high intensity with the triple section marking story, she's actually miscrypted, and she's written Mr. B. She's forgotten to do the cross lines on her curly X that would make it Mrs. B. And you can see two things like that she's inserted a correction to make sure it's accurate, that you know, the first time that she actually uses her finger in sex, that she's, you know, for the first time actually has to be inserted. So she wants that to be really accurate. And then you also can see that not everything in, or things in the crypt and the plain hand are not necessarily as easily demarcated as we've always theorized. You know, there is a lot of crossover between her sexual and social matters, and you can see that particularly here on the 15th of January, where in plain hand you get a triple section mark that says they left Monsieur and Madame de Bourfius, and she's gone off to Quai Voltaire with Mrs. Barlow. So, you know, it's not always so definitive that the crypt hand is used for one singular purpose and the plain hand is used for another. It's complicated.
Yeah.
How are we going for time, Jenna? Should we move on to the other ones and run through it very quickly, or?
I think we're doing all right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, let's keep cruising.
Okay. So if we go back to the journal, one of the other things, one of other Anne's distinctive practice in the 30th of January was she noted her writing, and we've gone through that. And here at the end of the day, she's also talking about how her reading and what her reading practices are.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So this is the symbol that Anne generally uses to mark when she has been reading something interesting that may have a bit of a, I think Dannielle, you had found that it sometimes also had a bit of a kind of a sexual layering to that in terms of like information associated with kind of sex and sexuality and things like that. And this is what Anne would use to mark those sections when she was reading things. Interestingly, she doesn't actually use it in this case. She didn't actually mark that line of when she was reading. Why? Not really sure. I don't know because if you noticed on the last slide, the line that she was saying that she was reading was actually an insertion. So it's
I didn't notice that.
Yeah. So it's interesting to, you know, maybe because it was an insertion, she just forgot because she added it later or something. Or if you know, if that cross symbol is a bit more complicated than just simply, oh, I read something. If, you know, there's like a certain bar that it has to reach before it gets marked in some way, you know, a certain level of importance or interest or, you know, seriousness.
I think it also, like, I think maybe because this is like one of those comedies, those French comedies, maybe it didn't have the normal, like the one I always think of as the classic with the cross mark is Johannes Secundus's Beyer of erotic poetry. So that was the classic fluidity of this cross mark. When it is marking literature, it's often marking sexual content of literature as well. But yeah, maybe because Moliere's, I think it's called The Bungler in English, is like a comedic play. I agree. Actually, I hadn't thought about that being an insertion. So maybe it's more weighted to her forgetting, but to me it's because it's not sexual. I went, right, she forgot, she didn't put the plus mark because it had no sexual content, whatever, you know.
Yeah.
PG rating.
Yeah, but I think that's a beauty of this kind of subject is really there hasn't been a lot done on her kind of this more kind of structural aspect of her journals. And so, you know, a lot of these symbols could be a lot more complex once we start looking at kind of across full volumes and across years and stuff.
Yeah. And normally when it was plus marked, then it went here to the literary index. And like you said, Jenna, it got inserted and it still made it to the literary index. The missing step here on this day, and I mean, Anne's human, so yeah, maybe it is a mistake, is that, so it's done the same transition. She just hasn't signed it the way that she normally signed it.
Yeah.
But the transition is here in the literary index, it's still noted.
Yeah. And the literary index was on the same pages as her usual index, but it would just be the last column on the page would act as the literary index. And it was kind of just a running list of what she was reading. Yeah. And it would include the page number of what she's talking about. So it was really easy for her to use. She could just, you know, find whatever book she was, or subject or whatever she was wanting to find that she was reading sometime. And then it'll tell her exactly what page that she needs to go to find it. So it was a really efficient system.
Yeah. And actually, now that you mention that about the insertion, it makes me wonder whether she had a particular order. Like, I mean, I always felt that she wrote the entries first, and then it's quite clear she does the indexing, and she always writes it that way too. You know, I wrote the above of today, and then she'll often note when she writes the index afterwards. And maybe that's when she comes to the literary index. And so maybe out of habit, this day, she did the journal entry, she did the index, then she went to write in her literary index that she had read the first account of Moliere. Maybe that's when she realised she hadn't actually written it into the journal entry. And then she went back to the journal entry and inserted it. So that kind of physical practice actually prompted her to go back and do the writing practice. Yeah,
it's interesting.
Yeah, it is. And then the last thing that she did or one of the last things she did on this day, as we saw, is she wrote all day. She read some, and then she wrote a letter to her aunt.
Yeah, literally in the middle of the night, like 3 a.m, because why wouldn't you write a letter then?
And the lovely thing about this is that apparently she, and you said this, Jenna, I remember, is apparently she spent hours and hours till the middle of the night writing this letter, but it's nothing particular. But somehow it's important enough that she stayed up in the wee hours of the morning to write nothing particular to her aunt.
Yeah, shows how important her aunt was.
And then we included a page of the letter here because they are such beautiful documents.
Yeah, and any of you who attended Chantel's wonderful session yesterday on the letters will recognize all of the bits and pieces of the letters that she was talking about, with the ends and the address panel and a little bit out for the seal. Yeah.
But it's also a really easy hand to read. And that's another writing practice, I think, that's perhaps common to the letters, is that they're, even though they might be, I don't know that Anne actually had a name for this writing. She had a name for her abbreviated hand, which was plain hand, and she had a name for her coding, which was script hand. But this is actually a longer hand again, and very few abbreviations, and not many crossing outs or anything like that. But it was a particular style of writing which she called epistolizing, and that's actually in this letter. Yeah,
and I kind of like what you're saying with the nothing particular. I like that she writes this line in this letter saying that she absolutely does not feel like writing letters, but we'll stay up until 5 in the morning to write a letter to her aunt. So,
And it's a really affectionate letter. It's a really warm letter. I love the letters for that reason. They've got a real romantic sensibility. They're very descriptive, usually quite stylized. And I think that's really captured by Anne, even having a term, epistolizing, is how crafted and how much care she took to write these beautifully engaging letters. This particular one, she actually talks quite openly with her aunt about her venereal taint and seeing the doctor and the treatment with her doctor. So again, in plain-hand or longhand, we have another area of her life that she's quite open about in a quite easily readable writing. And so again, we come back to this thing of the crypt and plainhand and the journal and the letters are all not easily separatable, and they're quite a rich and flexible system that Anne has.
Yeah.
And then we were having a laugh before because even the horse gets mentioned in this
Yes,
letter.
Hotspur, her ever favorite horse.
Sorry, skip too many.
Yeah, so the another symbol that she uses in the entries with regards to her letter writing is this L in the margin. And in this case, it actually comes into the margins on the next day's entry on the 31st, because she marks when she receives a letter and she marks when she sends a letter. So even though she wrote the letter on the 30th, it didn't actually get sent until the 31st. So that L marking doesn't come in until she actually sends the letter.
And then once she posts it then, I think at that point, again, like as her sort of normal process, she then notes it in her letter index. And this doesn't require the journal to be turned upside down. These were at the front in this Paris volume. These, and I think most of the 1820s volumes, this letter index was at the front of the volume. But as you can see from here, it's again a bit like the literary index in that it's a running table and it's just structured to be kept as she went. And here we can see the lovely detail of it, of the aunt's letter coming in on the 28th in the right-hand column, and Anne's reply 3 days later in the left-hand column.
Yeah, it was another very efficient system that she had, so that because obviously it's so much of, Anne was traveling a lot, she was moving around a lot. Her friends lived in different places, so many of her friendships and relationships and important people, those relationships were maintained through letters. So she really needed a good system to keep on top of all of that correspondence, and it's such an easy way to be able to, she can just open this and say, okay, who haven't I answered yet? Who do I owe a letter to? Or if she feels like she hasn't heard from someone in a while, she can go in like, when did I send them a letter? How long are they taking? She can go in and see how things are going, and keep track of like, who she needs to write to, who she's taking too long to write to. It's just a very efficient system and very usable.
And perhaps even it worked backwards too, actually. It suddenly occurs to me that the letter mark in the journal would also then be a reference point for her. She would know that from like the previous letter marked in the journal, she would know all the material written after that could be used to epistolize the next letter. So it's kind of, oh, okay, this is where I got up to telling my aunt about this, because that's at that point she marks the last letter.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah. So really, all of this material although it's in a way all in the journal, it's actually also dispersed through other types of, documents like the account books and the travelogues and the memoranda book, which we don't have, and the letters. But the journal is still such a primary focus, really, for, or is perhaps the connector for all of those other things. And as you can see, she has this complex system for using her journal as maybe the primary source material. So we thought we'd end on a quote of Anne and how important the journal is to Anne.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a nice one that shows, how important her writing practices were to her. But yeah, I think that's pretty much the end. Hopefully we've been able to kind of show a little bit of a different side of her writing practices than usually gets talked about. And I think a really interesting thing about all of this is, this is just a really small snapshot of a little piece of her life. And there's just so much more to learn about this, because we know that these practices changed throughout her life. Like she stops doing the indexing eventually completely. And so there's just so much to learn about, how these practices changed and how she adapted them to make them work with what her life is like at that period of time. I think it's an area ripe for much more research.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Here we go. So thanks for coming along and listen to us talk about Anne. And we hope that you've met Anne the journalist through this presentation. So I'll stop sharing there. There we go.
All right, so we can start doing some questions. We've got some coming in through the chat. So let's see, the first one. Do the entries with more frequent section marks share any attributes? Are they particularly emotional or on a particular theme / topic?
The entries largely in the journal largely seem to be, it's that one for one that we saw in that transition that we showed you. But like we also showed you, it's not always the case, but it tends to be, I want to note this, so it gets a section mark. I want to note this, and then it can be any topic, and it's just really signaling that this thing is important. Where it did start to form a story is in the Paris period, was in the index, where you get that single section marking tended to be a travelogue account of her trip to Paris, where the double section marking was the relationship as it started with Mrs. Barlow, but where she was also quite interested in a very sort of ill French lady, Mademoiselle de Sands, and there you get the relationship, sort of the vying interest in this double section marking story. And then, and they were about 40 or 50 section marks. The travelogue account was 100 and something section marks, but then you just get those 12 triple section marks in the Paris period. And that, to me, is Anne's story that she's telling herself about the relationship with Mrs. Barlow. And that is to me, the fact that it goes from 100 and something, 40 something to 12 does suggest an emotional intensity. And the 12 section marks are focused only on the relationship with Mrs. Barlow, but the double section marks sort of sometimes marked secondhand sexual knowledge she gets from Madame Galvani and her Paris booksellers, where she gets, I think that's where she buys the Beyer erotic poetry, or some other stuff that she's been looking to buy for ages, and hard to get erotic material in England. So she gets it in Paris. But it's complex, and I think that's what it always comes back to. Would you agree, Jenna? It's a rich, complex system. It's not always really clear cut.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like it was a kind of it seems really structured, and it was, but it was actually it could be quite fluid and flexible to meet Anne's needs. Just depending on the situation. Yeah. I don't know an answer to this one, but maybe you noticed if there is any rhyme or reason as to when she scribbles over mistakes, really crosses it out so you can't see it, versus when she just strikes it out, just a line.
I was able to sometimes actually read the writing under the strikeouts. So I did wonder that myself, whether something that's struck out is really struck out for a reason. I really don't want to see this or any evidence of this, or I've really made a mistake, or that's not quite the right way to write it. But there's definitely an intensity and a gradation between visible and invisible. I mean, because occasionally you could just, if you're, particularly when you're in the thick of doing the transcription and you get used to the rhythm of Anne's thoughts and the way she writes, and you can see where she comes up for a mistake and then what she's continuing with on after the mistake, I'm assuming it's a mistake. Then you can actually see what she's struck through, because you can grasp it from the material around it. Very occasionally too, material would be in the index that got struck out in the journal. So you'd have an access point that way. But I'm not sure. I mean, that's one thing I always wanted to do, and this was hard for me because I was working with digitized versions of the archival material, which was on microfilm, and I never actually got to see Anne's journals. And I always really wanted to be able to see her journals, because I suspected as well there would be other things like pages torn out, which you can't really see, or tears, or the heaviness of the pen maybe suggesting irritation or aggravation, or another form of emotional intensity, and those kinds of things I couldn't actually analyse at that remove. So one day I'd like to go look at them.
Yes. Okay, this is an interesting one. Regarding how Anne writes to the people in her life, would you say that she has a public-private persona depending on who she was writing to?
I think that's such a modern concept. We were talking about this earlier, weren't we, Jenna? My feeling is that, as a historian, that is a modern concept that's not really around so much in this Georgian early Victorian period, and it's actually starting to be created in this period. So I didn't analyse it that way deliberately, because I think there is a level of audience, and I think there are lots of different stories she's telling. There's a story she's telling herself, and my theory is that that's the index, the meta signage in the index. Then there's the story she does communicate to others, and she does that through letters, but she also does it through allowing people to read her journal, or giving others the correct hand. So I think it's more complicated than either a social sexual divide or a public private divide.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
But
I would agree as well. I think the lines are quite blurry between private and public. And I was just looking in preparing this presentation, was looking at some of the earlier days of the memoranda, and she says that she's reading aloud a month and a half of her journal entries to Maria Barlow. So even the journals themselves she was sharing with other people, and she specifically says that she didn't really leave very much out. So yeah, I think it's a lot more blurry than just kind of a stark difference, kind of like, yeah, what you're saying, there's kind of different degrees of audience that she's kind of writing to.
Yeah. And the classic example of that is she's writing in longhand, which anyone could read, to her Aunt Marion about her venereal taint. So it defies or makes complicated so many different questions about that. Here is someone who knows about her sexually transmitted disease, who's a family member, and she's writing it in a form of hand that, if the letter was lying around, could be easily read. So
yeah, it's very interesting. This one's for you, Dannielle. Do you think you'll return to your research into Anne in the future?
No, I thought about this after last year, actually. After the summit, I got all keen and I thought, oh, maybe I should publish, blah, blah, blah. But, you get to a point where you just move too far from it. So I come to the summit and I talk to all you people who love Anne. And that's where, But yeah, I actually was just talking to someone the other day who's just finished their PhD, and I said, publish now, publish while you can. I didn't, and I'm sorry, I didn't, So it's a little bit of a regret, The thesis is out there, and that's good. Even a few years before my thesis, things weren't available online, so it's nice to have it online. It's nice that people can access it.
Yeah, for sure. And kind of related, even if you aren't doing it, and I suppose I can answer this one too, but what further analysis are you or would you be interested in about this sort of subject?
Yeah, I mentioned this last year. I'd love to look at her venereal taint all the way through her life and just track one specific mark. I really would like to see if she used the meta signage in other years. Like I mentioned before, it's quite obvious almost by decades that her practice would stay fairly stable for a decade and then sort of shift. Like the 1920s volumes tend to be quite similar. So there's a possibility that the meta signage is actually evident in other 1920s volumes, but maybe she carried it on into her not 19s, what am I saying? 18s. 1830s volumes and things like that. And I did want to look at the Eliza Ray material. That first love. And I'd like to look at the end one day of the relationship with Mrs. Barlow too and see what happened there. So much to do.
There's so much.
A list to keep going.
It does. Yeah. I think I would really like to look at kind of the how the kind of overarching structure changes throughout her life, and how I'm just really interested in the transition from this like really rigorous laid out indexing system to then not using that anymore. And like she must have come up with a new way of like being able to find things relatively easily, but it wasn't really clearly laid out like the index, and where it's super easy. So she must have come up with these new systems, and that would be something that I would be quite interested to look into, how that changes as she gets older and starts having a lot more responsibilities around Shipton and is busy and has lots on, and how she kind of modified her technique to fit.
Because remember, you showed me, I wasn't aware of it. I'd never seen it before, that like funny long N that she was doing. Which got longer if she wanted to mark more lines, almost like an N, like note this, or was it just a squiggle? a real shorthand of, okay, when she's not indexing, this was the mark. Yeah.
Yeah.
Important.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And let's see, how else are we going?
Did anyone want to physically ask some questions?
Yeah, does anyone want to, can see if anyone wants to
Or
ask.
is it all in the chat?
It is all in the chat. But if anyone wants to raise their hand or anything, that is also fine. I think we've pretty much yeah, I think we've pretty much covered most of the questions, it looks like, scrolling through.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I've been writing it down in the chat.
Yeah.
It refers to if you think Anne might have left out some of the recordings in her journal because she had an event or an encounter that did actually not match with her own image of herself, like an erotic or sexual encounter with a woman of a low rank.
Oh. I suppose you have to factor it in as a possibility, don't you? That it, because it is because she is constructing, going from experience to constructing the journal to constructing an index, you have to think, okay, she did edit material out. But in the Paris period, the stuff that was really upsetting or traumatic actually got written about more rather than less. So, for instance, the treadmill business, which was a big event in and quite like embarrassing and shaming even for Anne, got written about over and over again. It got written about in the journal entries, it got written about in the letters. It even became something that she talked about with Maria as a, as sort of a defense of self and what she was doing and why she was there, and then how it got reported and her take on it. So that would be something really interesting to look at. It may be because it's actually something kind of from her period where it's actually not of her notice. So it might be that it's, she doesn't notice Cordingley or Mrs. Page, I think it is Mrs. Barlow's servant very much, except for when they intrude on sex and things like that. And yet Cordingley's a person. So, but she really doesn't appear in the writings a lot. So that would definitely be something worth looking at, I think, of how people come into the journals or don't figure very largely in her writings. I didn't really answer your question, but I think that's a really interesting one.
Yes, I'm very, very speculative, but after having read and thought about it and quite a lot, I think there is a slight chance she might have had an encounter with, some very rough, not rough person, but some woman, and she never records it because it clashes with her own idea about her own aristocratic self. Because she fantasizes about this. Janneke has written that, I know about that, fantasizes about having sex with some girl that walks along when she's working at the estate. But these are thoughts she's writing about, not real encounters. And real encounters might really damage her own image of herself. So we will never know, of course, because it's not in the journals, but it might be a possibility. I think it with all the sexual dynamics and energy Anne Lister had, through most of her life, I think this is very possible, could be possible.
I'm inclined to think it's probably unlikely just because of her own sense of status. And
so you think it wouldn't have happened in the first place?
Yeah, like just with like fantasizing is very different from actually, you know, acting on those fantasies. And I think she had a very strong sense of her position in society and wanting to move up in society. And I think that would have been a pretty big, and you know, it's not like she was having a hard time wooing women of her own class. So I think to me, it seems it would be quite out of character. But of course, as you say, you know, if it's not written in the journals, we have no way of knowing. So.
Well, actually, that occurred to me as we were talking. If you actually answer that archivally rather than from a knowledge of Anne, the answer would be that it must exist somewhere archivally if that was the case, you would think. Because she talks about destroying letters, and yet there are letters that still remain. And then there are letters that are noted in the journals and the letter indexes that are gone, but there's the evidence in the journals. So you see where I'm getting at? There would be a trace. And even though she destroyed material from Eliza, we know of Eliza. Eliza's traces remain within the archival material in a number of ways. So a total absence, I would have probably agree with Jenna there. It's unlikely that someone would be totally absent from any of the material. I think if there was an edited account, there would be some trace, because that is the case with others. And that's through deliberate manipulation and destruction and record keeping. They still survive some of that process in Anne's journals. So documentarily, I think, yeah, but who knows?
Yeah, she was a good record keeper. Okay, well, I think that pretty much wraps up our question time. So thank you everyone for listening to our session. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed chatting again, Dannielle, about Anne and all of the writing. It's always a pleasure. So
thank you, Jenna. Jenna did a lot of the work on the slides, so thank you very much, Jenna. Thanks for coming along.
Yeah, and enjoy the rest of the day.